Good morning, everyone. Hey, can I tell you a bit about myself that I've learned since going to college? Eventually, when I meet someone new, they're going to ask me, what do you do for work? A bunch of things happen. First thing, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I'm a full-time student, right? I look young, but I'm 31. It feels weird to say I'm studying full-time. Second thing, I have this weird thing of having to say, oh, I used to do product design, or I've gone back to study. I'm not quite comfortable saying I go to Bible college. See, I have this fear that they might think I'm one of those Christians. Oh, he's an idiot. He's probably a bigot. He's definitely a loser. See, it's because genuine Christian faith, or at least a faith that takes God and the Bible seriously, in our culture it's seen as irrelevant. Sometimes it's seen as harmful, and definitely on the losing side of history. And so what happens? I shrink back. I don't want to be judged. I don't want them to think less of me. I actually want people to like me, right? And so I give up an opportunity to glorify God and to tell them about the gospel. Have you ever found yourself in that situation? Maybe you're visiting this morning and you've asked the question, why would anyone call themselves a Christian gladly? Especially when society thinks it's weird, it's different, and you're on the losing side of history, you're on the losing team. Well, we're working through the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, and in the book of Daniel, we find an answer to that question and more. Here's some context for you. In the year 605 BC, the Babylonian Empire, ruled by this guy, King Nebuchadnezzar, they defeat the city of Jerusalem. They take a bunch of the upper class into exile. You can imagine what that was like. We actually read about it last week. They've taken them there, and their goal is to make the exiles like them, Babylonian. They want them to adopt the culture. They want them to adopt the values so that A, they don't rebel, they assimilate, and B, they lose any sense of identity, any sense of being different to everyone else. They're in a place where being faithful to the God of the Bible is unpopular and dangerous. And you'll notice then the question for them, as well as us this morning, is how do you remain faithful to the God of the Bible when there's so much to fear and so much that's uncertain in life? Daniel chapter 2 will equip you for courageous living in anxious times. That's the title of the sermon. What's the plan this morning? Well, we're going to see three things. Number one, paganism is futile. Number two, human power is fragile. And number three, God's kingdom is firm. That's the plan. We're going to jump in. Point one, paganism is futile. If you try to put God in a box, or you try and twist his arm behind his back to do your bidding, or you treat him like a vending machine, you'll be left in the dark because paganism is futile. And we're going to see that in this story of King Nebuchadnezzar, the pagan king of Babylon. So if you have Bibles with you, turn to verse 1. It says, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, and sorcerers and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me and I want to know what it means. And the astrologers answered to the king, may the king live forever. Ironic, given what we find out later. Tell your servants the dream and then we will interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and then interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses burned into piles of rubble. Yikes. He's acting like any human who's ever had ultimate power. People are just a tool to be used. I wonder if that reminds you of anyone. What exactly did Nebuchadnezzar see in his dream? Well, God reveals it to Daniel, and then Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, and we see it in verse 31. Why don't you jump there with me? Daniel says, your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing room floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar, suspects the dream is about him. After all, we'll find out next week, that he's intent on building a golden statue of himself, as one does. I think the gods are warning me. That's what he's thinking. And so what do his wise men have to do? Well, they have to do the right spell, the right hocus pocus, the right sacrifice, the right ritual so that the gods will be pleased and so that Nebuchadnezzar can avoid his future. That's what paganism is. It's when you worship false gods who are irrational, inconsistent. You never really know whether they're happy with you, no matter how much you do, and so you live life in fear. You're reaching out to them in the dark, but you never really know what's going on. Is that how you felt about God? The God of the Bible is not like that. He is faithful, loving, consistent, merciful, long-suffering. He is not indifferent to any of your struggles. And he's not playing games with you. Speaking of playing games, Nebuchadnezzar wants to play the ancient Babylonian party game. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Guess My Dream or Die. If his wise men can confirm the dream before they actually interpret it, then if they can't do that, then what power do they have? They'll just tell him what he wants to hear. They hope he'll change his mind, but he doesn't. And so what do they say? Pay attention here. Flick to verse 10. It says, they say to him, there is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. But they don't live among humans. Here's the question. The author of Daniel, why did he want his readers to see that part of the conversation? Well, I think it's because the pagan wise men are getting exposed. They're getting called out. They actually have no clue what they're doing, and they have to admit it. They can't help him with his problem. There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. The ancient Israelites, the exiles from this story, when they read Daniel, they needed to hear that. Why? Because when they had problems, instead of being faithful to God, what did they do? They chose paganism. They tried their luck with other gods who promised them rain for their crops. What did that mean? Well, it meant economic prosperity. Gods who promised them kids. What did that mean? Fertility, family, security. Gods who promised victory in war. What does that mean? That means power. Do you see how they're using religion as a means to an end? What does Daniel say to them? He says, no. Paganism is futile. It can't actually do anything. Paganism, if you go down that route, it'll leave you endlessly searching and you will never be sure. Never. Now here's the question, why does God want you to hear that part of the conversation? Here in Surry Hills in 2024. I think it's because, like me, you're in danger of putting God in a box, of treating him like a vending machine. Do you know what that looks like? Maybe you come to church, maybe you attend community groups, maybe you pray, maybe you give to church because you think it'll make God do something. Maybe that he'll owe you. If I come to church, maybe God will bring a man or woman into my life. If I'm a good Christian, God will protect me from suffering. If I do all these things, God will give me what I want. When life feels uncertain, and it often does, you want to be in control, don't you? I do. It's easy to fall for the illusion, in Sydney at least, that you can be in control, complete control. Don't treat Christianity like paganism, like every other religion does. They're futile. Why? Because God's not fickle. You can't bribe God, pay him off. Come to God not to get something or to gain control, Come to God because it reminds you that you're in the hands of the one who actually is in control. For some of us, paganism isn't our problem, right? But Daniel 2 points the finger at something else that we're all tempted to run to when you're anxious, when you worry, and that's power. Where I point to, human power is fragile. When evil people have power, we fear it, but it's not ultimate. When some of us think power will keep us safe, but it doesn't last. Power is fragile. King Nebuchadnezzar thought he was a god. He acted like that. And the Jewish exiles had every reason to fear him. But God says to them and to us, here are two reasons why his power is fragile. First, notice that God is the one who gives power. Do you remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream? He's standing in front of a giant and glorious statue made of different parts. And then Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. Whoo! Did you hear that? I'm the head of gold. But have a look at verse 37. What does Daniel say? Your Majesty, you are the King of kings. Whoo! Daniel, tell me more. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power, might and glory. Wait, did you catch that? Here is one of the most powerful men in all of history, King of kings, but it's God who gave him that power. As you read the story, you wonder whether Nebuchadnezzar only hears the good parts. God gives people power. Good people, bad people, God is the one who gives power. None of it is by accident. And so you can imagine if you're one of the exiles in Babylon, your future looks like it's in the hands of this erratic tyrant king, and any day he can just flip his lid and then turn your life upside down. And so what do? You're tempted to think, I think it's wise to just blend in a little bit. Make sure everyone doesn't know we're Jewish. Just till things change. Some of us live that way today. Tempted to blend in because Christianity isn't popular. You never mention church to your coworkers when you talk about the weekend. You're afraid to say something to family because it might mean losing their love or support. You compromise in some area of faith because you say to yourself, not right now, just till things change. If that's you, you need to hear that God is in control. And you need to know that he calls you to be faithful regardless of your circumstances. God gave Nebuchadnezzar his power, but he says to the exiles, I want you to be faithful even if the people and the king are totally against you. That's the first reason Nebuchadnezzar's power is fragile. God gave it to him, which means he can take it away, right? Here's the second reason Nebuchadnezzar's power is fragile. It comes to an end. God does take it away. And if you look at history, it reminds us that all human power comes to an end, all of it. Read verse 39 with me. You flick there. What does Daniel say will happen to Nebuchadnezzar? He says, after you, another kingdom will arise. And the important part there is the after you, right? That's a very big but. After you, Daniel says, your wealth and prosperity, it's impressive, but it'll come to an end. Your resume is impressive. Cool, King of Kings. But after you will come a bunch of kings and other kingdoms, and they'll replace each other, and on it goes, whatever history. Nebuchadnezzar's power is fragile. In his dream, the statue and all its parts, they represent all the human kingdoms, they're smashed. They crumble and turn to dust. Kings and kingdoms, presidents and dictators, democracies, tyrannies, monarchies, they all come and go and enter the garbage bin of history, eventually. Their stuff will end up in the dirt or sold to a museum. You ever heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? They look amazing. What about the Ishtar Gates? They're beautiful, majestic, and they're symbols of power. But guess who built those? Nebuchadnezzar. But his kingdom is gone. All that stuff is gone. It's in the dirt, or whatever is left of it is in the British Museum. Here's the thing. If you were living there, you would have walked through Babylon. That's a painting, by the way. This rich and glorious, prosperous city. You're walking through it, and you would have thought, yeah, this is the place to be. We just got exiled into slavery, but yeah, this is the place to be. I can really build a future here. I guess being Babylonian isn't so bad after all. I guess I don't need God. I can turn my back on him. After all, the God we worship let us lose and come here. Here's the question for you. Do you treat Sydney the same way? Do you imagine that Sydney offers you endless prosperity, endless opportunity, endless safety, leisure, amazing beaches, amazing lifestyle? This is the place to be. Whether you were born here or you moved here, and a bunch of you have, that's the appeal of Sydney, isn't it? This is the place to be. You're thinking, it's not so bad being Babylonian. Faithfulness can wait. Being generous to other people, it can wait, especially when there's so many things I don't have yet. Committing to church can wait. After all, work's so busy, and I'm making my parents proud. Faith is okay, just as long as it's private, and just as long as it doesn't get in the way of the important stuff, Is that you? Are you busy carving out your own little kingdom inside of Sydney? Is that your hope and your confidence? Because if it is, it's fragile. It's fragile. Your power is fragile. Your stuff will one day end up in the dirt or in someone else's garage sale or on Facebook Marketplace for really cheap. All human power is fragile, even yours. Well, if we can't look to power, where can we look to for hope and confidence? We're at our final point. God's kingdom is firm. God promises an everlasting kingdom, and he says it's certain even though it might look slow, it might look weak, and it might look unimpressive. But it's the only place where your hope and your confidence will not be destroyed. God's kingdom is firm, and it offers you hope for your future and hope for your present. Hope for your future, hope for your present. First, for the future. I wonder if you noticed that instead of leaving you to search in the dark like paganism does, God reveals. He reveals. He reveals what life is about. In verse 21, Daniel praises God and he says, he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in the darkness. Many of us would love to know what lies in the darkness. And light dwells with him. When you worship a false god or no God, you're left in the dark. You're out in the dark. The God of the Bible doesn't do that to you. He reveals what he's doing in the world. He's perfectly clear. He tells you in verse 44. He says, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. You realize that's a picture of where history is headed? A picture of God's unstoppable kingdom, inevitable, unending. If you read through Daniel chapter 2, and I encourage you to do it, 30 times the passage uses the word revealed, showed, made known. That's the point of the passage. God reveals. Have you ever watched a movie when someone spoiled the ending for you? You already knew where it was heading, right? A few annoyed laughters. If there's jump scares, they still scare you, right? If there's evil, it still kind of shakes you. Sad moments still break your heart. You're still going to shed a tear. But you already know what happens in the end. You know where it's all headed. You're not as lost as everyone else watching the movie. And for those of you who look closely, you can look at the hints, the messiness of the story, the plot, and kind of see how it all fits together in the end. That's what life now is like. Jesus is coming back. His kingdom is growing, even if it looks small and unimpressive. It's like a little seed growing into a huge tree. But that doesn't mean you're immune to evil or suffering. life is still full of intimidating and scary things. You will still have heartbreak. The world is still broken and it's run by broken people. You get a reminder of that every week. But God's kingdom is growing. God's good kingdom is where it all ends up. Perfect justice, no suffering, no evil, nothing to be scared of in the dark. Nothing can take that away from you. You know where it's all headed. What do we call someone who doesn't know where they're headed? Lost. You are not as lost as everyone else. But you do have a choice. In every moment of doubt, and there'll be plenty, will I turn to futile and fragile hopes? Will I trust in the promise of God's kingdom that will never end and will never be destroyed? That's your hope for your future. Lastly, and I'll finish on this, hope for your present. Imagine with me, there you are, one of the Jewish exiles. They've destroyed your city. They've taken you away into Babylon, and their goal is to make you like them, to assimilate you. But you're not really one of them. Not really. You're not really Babylonian, and they know it. And so any day, you could be thrown into a furnace or fed to the lions. God, where are you? What are you doing? Is this all really worth it? The pressure to hide, to give up, to be like everyone else, it's real, it's palpable. So how do you live as a faithful exile? How do you keep your faith when it's considered weak and unpopular? How do you resist the urge to hide your faith, especially if it might mean suffering, sacrifice? Well, I think it's by seeing that God brings his kingdom not with power, but through weakness. Do you remember the stone in Nebuchadnezzar's dream? Tiny little detail, you might have forgotten about it. Let me read about it again with you from verse 34. It says, "While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them." Verse 35 at the end. "But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth." A weak little stone breaks this huge statue that's supposed to represent human power. It starts a growing kingdom that God says will fill the whole earth. That little stone is supposed to point you to Jesus. This weak human being, a carpenter's son from a no-name town, a frail and lonely man, crucified on a Roman cross, humiliated and despised by everyone around him. How can you have hope when remaining faithful is hard? It's by seeing that you have a servant king who gave up his power for you. It's the reason you can live courageously now when there's pressure to hide your faith, to give up, to get all the power for yourself, to build your little kingdom. If you try and do all that without seeing the God that became weak for you, your faithfulness will just feel like an obligation. Instead of feeling like a response of thankfulness and joy. The God who became weak for you. Hey, maybe you're not there yet. Maybe this morning you're not sure about faith. You're not sure about Jesus. Welcome, by the way. You're not sure about Christianity maybe because you have expectations. Everyone has expectations. You have expectations of what Christianity should be. That it maybe should be powerful. If it really is true, if Christianity really is true, then it should be growing. But it kind of looks like it's in decline here in Sydney. Well, maybe here in Sydney, in rich Western middle-class places, but look at us Asians and Africans, we're growing. God's kingdom is growing. Maybe you thought, hey, if it really is true, then Christianity should be more acceptable. It should be more palatable. At least it should feel right with me. You know, Nebuchadnezzar, if you read the story, he only sees what he wants to see. We have the same problem. We don't see things the way God does. Kind of blind. I wonder if that's you this morning. The Apostle Paul, he wrote to the Corinthian church and he said this: the message of the cross of Jesus is the power and wisdom of God for those who are being saved. Power and wisdom. So let me ask you, are you tired of desperately searching in the dark? Never sure of what God or the gods of the universe thinks of you, never sure of what your future holds, you're in the dark. Then the cross of Jesus is the power and wisdom for you. Because it tells you that God does care for you, that you matter, that you have a future to look forward to. Are you done desperately trying to build your little kingdom here on earth with all the worry and anxiety that just brings to you? Then the cross of Jesus is the power and wisdom of God for you. Because through it, he offers you an everlasting and eternal kingdom. Nothing can take that away from you. Remember what the pagan wise men said to Nebuchadnezzar when they realized they couldn't fix his problem? What did they say? They said, no one can reveal it to the king except the gods. And they don't live among humans. The good news of Christianity is that God has lived among humans. He lived, he died, he rose again, and when he comes back, for those who belong to his kingdom, you will know no fear, no anxiety, no uncertainty. That's not fragile. That's not futile. It is a firm promise for both your future and for your life now. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, you are the good and glorious God of heaven, and you have set history in motion to your final kingdom where there is no fear of the dark, no suffering, no evil. But God, we every day are distracted. We are so anxious. We turn to building our own little kingdoms. We grab at power, and we treat you in ways that we shouldn't. But God, we thank you that Jesus died and he rose again, and we have a sure and firm hope of an everlasting kingdom. But God, as we go into the week, when the world will shout at us, you are weak. How do you fix that? You gain power. Father, please help us to set our eyes on Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.